How's it going, y'all? I'm Nate Drolet, and welcome back to the Advanced Climbers series. I've got something pretty fun for y'all today. Looking ahead towards the rest of this series, we've got about 20 more points to cover, and as I looked through them, I realized there were quite a few different points having to do with weakness. How do you assess your weaknesses? How do you address them? How is this different now than when you were a beginner or intermediate climber? And I decided to take all of these different points and put them together into one weakness-themed episode. With any tips that I give, there's going to be some overlap from one to another, and that's just kind of natural. Different aspects of climbing have overlap. They aren't siloed in their own way. I can talk about footwork and getting stronger on crimps. The two will have a lot in common. Because of this overlapping that happens, I thought it would be worthwhile to see what does it look like if we try and put 4 or 5 different points into one episode so that when these overlaps do happen, it can all be together in one place and hopefully it feels a little more cohesive to y'all. If you like this structure, let me know in the comments down below. If you prefer having a bunch of different points from different topics in each episode, also let me know that. As I finish up the Advanced series and move on into the Elite series, I can kind of form them to bend towards what y'all like a little bit better. I expect that this episode will be a little bit longer than most. How's it going, y'all? Future Nate here. In circumstances that were entirely foreseeable, I recorded all of the points having to do with weaknesses, and it turns out it was a lot. It made for a very long video, so I decided to chop it in half, and this is part 1. You'll be getting part 2 next week. So let's go ahead and get started. Number 79. The difference between low-hanging fruit and weaknesses. I think this is an important place to start because we often talk about low-hanging fruit and weakness fairly synonymously. Earlier on in your climbing, people will tell you all the time, one of the fastest ways to get better is to work your weakness. Or they'll say, working your weaknesses, that's a low-hanging fruit. And it all gets kind of blended in together so much that we just assume anytime you fix a weakness, that's the best way to spend your time. And I would argue that's not necessarily true once you become an advanced and an elite climber. Let's start by defining the two. I would define a weakness as a relevant physical attribute or skill within climbing that for your current level or your goals, you have a deficiency in, where a low-hanging fruit is just something that's easy to fix and it's going to have immediate payoff in your performance. And this is why it's called a low-hanging fruit. It's fruit that's easy to pluck. To me, the biggest distinction here is that not all weaknesses are low-hanging fruit. Now that you're a more advanced climber, you've been doing this for a long time, man, some of your weaknesses you might have already put a couple years into and you're still not that great at them. For every individual, there are going to be attributes that you take to really naturally. Maybe endurance comes very easy to you, but explosive power doesn't. You might spend years and years trying to become more powerful, where endurance is something that can kind of just sit on the back burner and it's always fine for you, and that's great. Everyone has these things. Not all weaknesses are low-hanging fruit. Another good example here is, let's say you get scared climbing above a bolt. Well, let's dig into that. Maybe you had a really bad accident when you started climbing. You had a severe injury, you had to go through a lot of surgeries. It took you years to get back to climbing, and you want to get back to sport climbing, but you're really scared sport climbing. Is that a weakness? Yes. Is this a low-hanging fruit? Absolutely not. That's a very challenging thing to overcome. And to call it a low-hanging fruit, I think it does it a disservice because it's going to be a challenge to take care of this thing, and it's going to be hard work. And if it's something that you're able to overcome, you should feel proud of that. It's not just a simple low-hanging fruit that you go up, you pluck, and you're done with. Now, looking at examples of low-hanging fruit, for a lot of people, this could be getting better sleep. If you only sleep 6 hours a night, getting to like 7.5, 8 as an athlete, that's going to make a really big difference. Doing mobility work consistently, that is low-hanging fruit for a lot of people. Simply trying harder boulders. If you say your goal is to climb V10, but then you go out and you spend your entire season never trying V10, yes, literally going and trying V10, that is low-hanging fruit. That is an easy fix, especially if you're already going outside and climbing. It is just a matter of going to a different boulder problem than the one you're going to now. At this point in your climbing career, low-hanging fruit is going to have the fastest carryover to performance. It's going to be much more immediate. And this is most likely because you've been climbing long enough that even your weaknesses are probably pretty good. you likely have taken time to work on them. But also, let me pause and say, if you haven't stopped and worked on a weakness before, let's say if you're bad at slopers, literally just go in, warm up. Once you're warm, spend the first 30 minutes of your hard climbing on slopey boulders, and then do whatever you want afterwards. Maybe at the end of the session, if there is some easier climbs that are sloper boulders that you find challenging, run laps through all of those. Let's say you're a V7 climber, maybe there's some V3s and 4s that are really slopey that they just feel so much harder than V3 and 4 should be. Maybe end every warm-up, repeat those, and then end your day by repeating them again. You do this, and after a couple of months, you're going to be kind of okay at slopers. Now, you're not going to be the best sloper climber in the world, but it's not going to be some glaring weakness. And this is a pretty straightforward and simple way to address weaknesses. Whenever you're feeling fresh and have the most energy, put your time into the thing that you're worst at. It's a pretty simple way to go. If you haven't done that yet, just start there. But if you have already done this, if you've spent time working on your weaknesses, then chances are it's not an overnight fix. It's not as simple as just sleeping an extra hour a night. You'll have to be much more methodical and thoughtful with your approach, and that is something we'll go over 2 points from now. My recommendation for how to view low-hanging fruit versus weaknesses is, if you have low-hanging fruit, just take care of those things. Just because they're easy to take care of doesn't mean that they won't have a large impact. I have worked with so many climbers who, by simply getting more sleep or tracking their macros or things like that, have had enormous changes in their performance. And every single time when it happens, they're like, why haven't I been doing this for years? This is not that hard, and I climb so much better now. With low-hanging fruit, if you can take care of it, just take care of it. It's great. But at this point, with weaknesses, we're kind of playing the long game. And if you're finding these tips helpful, I would find it incredibly helpful if you hit that subscribe button down below. Number 80, reassessing your strengths and weaknesses. This one is really important for advanced climbers because when you're a beginner and intermediate, things change every day. Seemingly, it's like month after month, your climbing changes so much. Now that you're more advanced, changes feel a little bit more slow because you're there for all of it. You're living in your body. It's hard for you to perceive changes as they happen. If you have a climbing partner, maybe you don't climb with them for 6 months. Maybe they went on a trip or whatever and they come back. It's so easy for you to see the changes in their climbing, where for them, maybe it doesn't feel like anything's different. This is one of the challenges of assessing, are we getting better? Because of this, there's a balance we need to learn how to strike. We need to figure out what our weaknesses are, and then from there, we need to put our head down, be really patient and consistent, and just do the work, and not worry so much about, am I having day-to-day changes? Is it getting better? Because if you're stressing out in a very short-term kind of way, chances are you're going to change things up so quickly that you're not going to see the type of improvements that you want. There's a lot to be said for putting your head down and doing the work. However, every now and then we have to lift our head back up and make sure we're still on course. Are we traveling in the right direction? Have we reached our destination? How much longer do we have to go? These things are all very important to know, and checking in occasionally is very valuable to make sure that your time is spent in the best way possible. I am personally of the belief that testing your weaknesses in climbing is best done with climbing. Shocking, I know. If you think that jumping between crimps is what is so challenging for you and you want to get better at it, there's no better way to see are you getting better than testing yourself against boulder problems where you're having to jump between crimps. If you want to see if you have better endurance, big bumpy sport climbs are a good way to do it. We want to make sure if we are shooting for a goal that we have good measuring tools. Now, I think there is still a place for looking at how strong you are with lifts or hangboarding or other rudimentary measuring methods, but there is nothing that I've seen yet to date that can replace climbing as your metric. Ideally, you're going to be using climbs that don't disappear, so these can be climbs that are outside. Those can work really well. Every season you come back, you can kind of check back in on some of these things and see, okay, how does it feel now compared to back in the spring? A big downside to this, though, is that it's very condition dependent. You need good weather. You can't just go year-round to these outside climbs and expect to have them be a good measuring tool. For that reason, I really like standardized training boards, things like the tension board, moon board, kilter board, decoy, anything like that I think is super valuable. And the reason for this is We want tools that we can come back to year after year. You've been in this game for a long time. It's no longer about, ooh, how do I feel now versus a month ago? Like, that's nice. We like that. But really, I want to know, am I getting better year after year, quarter after quarter at the very least? Having these boulder problems as measuring sticks that I can use and say, okay, how do I feel on heel hooks? How do I feel on slopers? How do I feel on crimps? And I can kind of come back to every few months to check back in and see, is the work I'm doing actually paying off? That's so valuable. My general rule of thumb here is pick problems that highlight your weaknesses, and then from there, try not to climb on them too much. I like preserving them as measuring tools. You can check in every now and then, but we don't want to be training for the test. If you pick a boulder problem and you say, oh, like this is a really good representation of jumping between crimps, and then you go and you just project it, and then you're like, oh, well, I've gotten a lot better at it. Like, you're training for the test. Like, that's not the perfect way. But I will say this is another reason why I like climbing as a measuring tool. Like, there are worse tests to study for. It's like, oh no, I got really good at this style that I'm also weak at, and now I'm more proficient at it. Yes, we kind of lose this metric a little bit by training on this boulder, but yeah, at the same time, it's going to get you better at the thing you want. So it could be worse. But if we're living in an ideal world, pick something where you're like, if I did well on this, that would mean I'm moving in the right direction. And then choose other boulders maybe similar to it in that same style to be able to train on. You don't have to, but it's a nice compromise. And I think you'll be much happier down the road because of it. And the reason for this is if you do train on your test boulder, you might end up just convincing yourself, well, did I actually get stronger at this thing? Am I better at jumping between crimps? Or did I just project this thing into the ground and I'm just good at this one thing? Now, I would argue that you probably got both, but confidence is so important in higher level climbing. And if we can do something that helps build confidence, if you're training elsewhere and you come back to this thing and you just smash it, or suddenly you went from doing none of the moves to you can do every single move, we know you didn't just specifically train for the test by doing this thing. Clearly you improved from all the other climbing you did, and it's showing up on our benchmark. That's great. That builds some confidence. Beyond using climbing as your way of assessing your strengths and weaknesses, kind of climbing things and seeing what continuously stops me, there are 3 other methods that I really like for helping assess where you're at and what your weaknesses are. One is to talk to your climbing partner. They see you climb more than anyone else. Chances are they have a good hunch. At the very least, they might be like, I feel like whenever you get to holds, you can hold them and you look really strong. It seems like doing the big moves between them, whenever we climb together, it always feels like that's the thing that stops you the longest. Something like that. And that's great advice. If you can get something like that, amazing. Your climbing partners will likely know, even if they're not consciously thinking about it as y'all climb together, in the back of their mind, they're going to start recognizing patterns. If they're doing it, take advantage of it. The second way is think about what advice you would give someone else who is in your same situation. Most of us have this bad habit of we can give good advice, but when we give ourselves advice, we're these special snowflakes. We need all the different unique little exercises. We need to squeeze out the 1% gains here and there. And our life is very special and unique in all of its own ways. And it is, to be fair. But we really get lost in the sauce, where if you're going to give someone else advice, normally we're going for the big chunks. We want to give good advice to someone else. It's so much easier to see the obvious answers when you're talking with someone else. And because there is this desire to give good advice that you feel confident will work, you're probably going to rely more on fundamentals, on things that will most likely work rather than, these really niche methods that maybe work, maybe won't, I don't know. So trying to put yourself in an outside perspective and say, all right, let's look at myself as if I was someone else. What are things to keep in mind? How old is this person? What is their climbing age, their training age, their injury history? What is their sport, essentially? So do you do boulders? Do you climb routes? What kind of routes, if so? Things like that. Honestly, a little more vague is better, in my opinion, rather than diving too deep into the minutia. And then what do these people tend to fail on? What do they spend their time on? This person says they want to climb 513. How many 512s have they done of every grade? How fast do they do these 512s? If they have done a bunch, how much time are they spending on 513? What I love about this exercise is that it lets you have this aha moment, this light bulb moment of your own, because chances are you know what you need to do. So it's hidden somewhere back there. And that gets me to my third point. And that is simply the last good way to figure out what your weaknesses are is be honest with yourself. Something that happens fairly often when I do consultations with people. I'll watch video of them. I'll look through spreadsheets of all their training. We'll have a long conversation about all the ins and outs of their climbing career. And at the end, I'll say, hey, here are 2 or 3 things that I think are really valuable for you to sink your time into. And it's fairly common that at least for one of those things, people will just be like, oh, I know, I've already known this and I haven't been taking care of it. And yeah, I get it. Like some of these things aren't the most fun. I know some of my own weaknesses that I'm like just kicking the can down the road on. But if you can stop and be honest with yourself and say, okay, this is a thing I do need to work on. It doesn't make me feel powerful. It doesn't make me feel strong. I don't feel like a good climber when I work on these things. And that's frustrating, but I know it's here and it's been here for years. I think most of us have at least one of those things in us. Try and dig that up and see what you can find. If after all of this, you still have a hard time figuring out what your weaknesses are, I'd love to help. I've left a link down in the pinned comment below where you can schedule a remote coaching call with me. You can send me all the video you want, spreadsheets, whatever you'd like. Let's have a conversation. Let's try and get you on the right path so that you can keep improving with climbing and hopefully maybe even have a little more fun with it. Number 81, rethink the story that you've told yourself. All right, this might be my favorite point in the entire Advanced Climber series. I'm going to elaborate on it a decent bit. I've got a handful of anecdotal stories to share with you. This one, I think, holds back advanced climbers maybe more than anything else. Especially, I would say, elite climbers. This one is very common. The longer you've been climbing, the more likely this is true for you. If you ask any person to describe their climbing, they tell you a story. They'll tell you, oh, well, I started as a sport climber, mostly technical, vertical stuff. And then later on, I got into bouldering, but because I'd climbed vert for so long, I'm just not very powerful. I'm better at longer boulders because I've got that endurance, but I've never been explosive. I'm good at small holds from all that technical vert crimping, bad at slopers. This is who I am. We've all got a story of what shaped us. Maybe you were an athlete before climbing, and that shapes the way you look at things. Maybe you had a different discipline or a series of injuries or certain successes early on, and those have remained part of your story. Another thing that's really big is if you've been climbing long enough, we know more information now than we did early on. This is super, super critical. When you're a newer climber, you don't know a whole lot. Also, I've been climbing 20 years. The narratives around climbing and climbing styles and what was possible, how you got better back in 2005 are so different than how they are now. Even though I try to stay up to date with everything, my brain is still rooted to the things I believed in 2005 in a lot of ways. When I first started climbing, my climbing gym didn't have grades above V6. I had been climbing, I think, 3 or 4 years before I ever saw V10 in a climbing gym. And I remember it just seemed like the craziest thing. That's part of my story. With my coaching, I've worked with a lot of women who started out climbing. Having not been athletic prior to climbing, they really leaned into maybe sport climbing or vert climbing because they felt like that's where they could shine. They weren't super physically strong, so they really leaned into that. And then maybe I start working with them 10 years later, and they tell me this story. They say, I'm not powerful. I'm a vert climber. I'm a sport climber. I struggle anytime something gets steep and powerful and strength oriented. We'll start working together and I'll watch them climb, and a funny thing starts to happen. In their mind, they have this story of they are a weaker climber, but on the wall, they're not. They're very capable of climbing powerfully. They maybe don't have the skills to do it yet. They don't know how to move powerfully because they've never believed that they could. And so we have to learn, okay, how do you use momentum? Where do you generate from? How do you follow through a move so that you can start powerful and end powerful? How do you do all of these things? And It's a lot of fun because it is such a quick turnaround from big moves are hard, I can't do them, to, oh, actually, I have been strength training for years, and turns out a decade of rock climbing builds muscle and builds strength. They have all of these attributes to be a new climber, and they just have to change their story. Another example that I really like is that Dave McLeod, maybe I think 2 years ago or so, went over to Lattice and did a whole YouTube video on testing his metrics. He wanted to see, okay, well, how's his fitness, how's his strength, all these different things, so that he could have some more objective measurements. Now, I've been reading Dave's blog since I think like 2005, 2006. I've been a huge fan of his forever, read his book multiple times. And a story that Dave tells all the time is that he is a weaker climber. He gets by with tactics and technique and tenacity, but he's just not a very strong climber, and especially his hands. He has always said, I've got really weak hands. I have to train them. I have to be so diligent because my hands are so behind the curve for how hard I climb. And he has said this for, 2 decades now. What was so cool about him going and doing this Lattice test is we got to see in real time Dave learning the actual truth. This new addition to his story when they told him, actually, your hands are quite strong. It turns out 2 decades of fingerboarding does work, thank God. We can get somewhere, y'all. But yeah, they were like, hey, your hands are actually quite strong. You're very capable. And you could see the gears turning in his head of, oh, this thing I've told myself forever, like, yes, it was true at a time, but all this work I've done, it's changed me. And what am I capable of now? What could I be doing? Can I maybe climb 515 one day? And that's such an exciting thing, especially for someone who has such a seasoned career as Dave, who has been doing this for so long that even at his age, he can be like, oh, there's more left in the tank. I think I can do more than I thought I could. And that's so amazing. I want that for everyone, to be able to stop and rethink the stories we've told ourselves, and to realize that we have so much more potential than we ever believed. All right, so last example here, and this is me being a little selfish. This is my own. This was maybe a year and a half ago. I had this massive revelation. To me, it's hilarious thinking back about it, because I'm like, how did you not see this? But hopefully this can help some of y'all to rethink your own story. I started climbing in 2005 at a bouldering only gym. Like, they had top ropes, but it was 20-foot walls. So essentially just slightly taller boulders, but with the hassle of having to top rope. My first 2 years of climbing were exclusively in this bouldering gym, and all I did was boulder. Anytime there would be a new set of top ropes, we'd go through, we'd do them all, but whatever. That was like a 2-week adventure out of the rest of the year. And then the rest of the year, we were bouldering. And then I tried going outside and sport climbing. The first day I went out, I didn't fall on anything I tried. It was just a fun, moderate day of, okay, let's learn how to be outside. The second day I went sport climbing, I flashed an 11 plus and climbed to 12A. The third day I went climbing outside, I climbed to 12B and like 3 tries. And at this time, I was bouldering like V4, V5, and it didn't make sense to me. It seemed strange that I focused on bouldering, but without ever even trying, I was just so much better at sport. Now, that said, I was a distance runner, and also I had been a swimmer before that, so doing more endurance-oriented sports has always suited me, in my opinion. Like in the story I tell myself, I am an endurance athlete, and so, I don't know, this just kind of clicked. I was like, well, yeah, I've been bouldering, but I still run like 50 miles a week on top of all the bouldering I do. Maybe I just have better endurance. And at this time in the early 2000s, there was very much this belief of, well, either you're an endurance climber or you're a powerful climber. You can't be both. And it's a trade-off. If you're trying to do both, you're going to lose. You have to specialize, kind of thing. I was like, well, apparently I'm just built for sport climbing. And this became the story I told myself. When I ended up moving out east to go to college, I climbed at the Red River Gorge a bunch because, I was like, well, I guess I'm a sport climber. That's what I'm better at. But I did all this sport climbing, and my sport and boulder grade always just rose together. Even though I would spend most of the year bouldering, I would probably spend, 7-8 months bouldering and the rest of the time sport climbing. When I climbed V5, I could climb 12D. When I climbed V8, I could climb 13B. When I climbed V10, I could climb 14A. They always moved up together. And it always felt like I had to put so much work into bouldering to get better. And sport climbing just kept going up. And, but I just told myself, this is just how it is. Like, I am an endurance athlete, apparently. It was only a year and a half ago that I accidentally challenged this story. I was explaining to someone how I used to train in my first 2 years of climbing. So we were in a bouldering gym, and there's this big traverse on the whole back of the wall, and it was about 70 moves. Realistically, it was probably like 511 minus. So, I mean, before I could even climb V2, I had projected this. And every day when I would go in, I would do the traverse at least once. I would go and I would boulder, and then I would burn out on the traverse. I would just do it as many times as possible. But that's not enough. So already you're like, okay, well, yeah, this is kind of starting to make a little more sense on how you were a boulderer who did sport climbing. But it gets even better. So at the gym I started climbing at, there's a guy named Tom Carter who was a sport climber, and he liked to set these long circuits. Regularly, we would be projecting short, hard boulders, but then there were these big circuits that were 30 moves, 50 moves, sometimes even longer on sustained steep overhanging climbs. And we would project these circuits just as much as we projected normal boulders. My normal week would be, I would project short boulders, I would project circuits in the 20 to 30 move range, I would project boulders in like the 50 move range, and then I would start and end every session with just a ton of laps on a 70 move 511. And when I explained this to someone, it was comical because I was like, oh, if I wanted to train a sport climber in a bouldering only gym, this is kind of how you would do it. This checks most of the boxes. I wouldn't change a whole lot from that. In my mind, because I was in a bouldering gym, I thought I was training as a boulderer, but realistically, I was doing an incredible amount of endurance work this entire time. It wasn't that I was doomed to be a sport climber and forever held out of reach from the grace of power and bouldering prowess. Yeah, it was just, I got what I trained for. Like, it makes a lot of sense. You get better at the things you practice, and so by me just doing a ton of endurance work all the time, that's what I got better at. And another thing that added to this was because I had been a distance runner, in my mind, doing the work and trying hard meant doing more. I took that mindset to rock climbing. Even when I moved out east and I went bouldering, in my mind, bouldering workouts mean do as many boulders as possible. Don't rest for very long. Just keep rapid firing. Any method you can think of for not developing power, I essentially was doing on accident because I just didn't understand how it worked. And the reason this is all important is that I kept this story with me for literal decades, like 17, 18 years. I told myself, no, I can't be a powerful boulderer. That's not me. I'll have to be tactical, technical. Maybe I can leverage my endurance and some other things to be able to climb well. But, I just don't believe in my heart that I can be a great boulderer. I have this entire story to show me that that's just not the case. And I have to say, when I realized this was the case, that this was this false narrative I had been clinging on to without even realizing it, it was great. It was exciting. It has made me more exciting for bouldering than ever before because, I'm not shaped by this story I told myself so long ago and that I've held on to. I can do other things. And when I work with people, when I talk with climbers about their long history of climbing, of bouldering, of sport climbing, of trad, all these things, this to me is one of the most important things of let's look at the stories we've told ourselves. What are the things that you continue to tell yourself today that are holding you back? Maybe you say, I can't put on muscle. I'm just not built like that. I struggle to be powerful. My hands are weak, and that's how they are. I'm very injury prone, and that's something that I have to deal with. Not to say that some of these things don't hold merit, but how much power are you letting them hold over you? And what could your climbing look like if you let go of some of them? All right, y'all. Thanks for sticking around. Let me know how you liked this episode. Did you enjoy having an entire episode specifically about one topic? If so, let me know. If you prefer just a little sampler plate of different things, let me know. Also, I know this is a longer one. How was that? Was this terrible? Did you just skip through everything? Did you at least let it run in the background while you were showering? I don't know. Once again, I want to say thanks for all of the great dialogue that we've had. I appreciate the comments y'all leave down below, and I try and interact with y'all as much as I can. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next week.